Wonderful, thank you, and welcome everyone. As we've just heard, it is the last day, but that does not mean it is not going to be the most fantastic day that we have had thus far. I'm delighted today to be able to bring you 3 experts who are going to help us discuss how to decode disease in a variety of different ways. Hopefully you've picked up the word code is in there, so we do have experts who are going to be talking about the variety of different things that we need to think about to actually understand data. Understanding biology, we are joined with a physician today who will be able to talk to us a bit more about both the patient and also the clinical side of disease. And then we have some experts who are going to be able to weave into the conversation a variety of different ways that you tease out that data to be able to make sense of the biology. So we do have on the stage with us today Junaid Bajwa, we have Mark Davies, and we have Chris Bishop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow the individuals to have a bit of time to discuss their area of expertise, how this all comes together in their mind, and then at the end of it, we'll have a little bit of a discussion. So do feed in your questions. We'll try to pick them up and weave them into the conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to Junaid now to give us a little bit of perspective, who he is, a bit of background, and how diseases need to be decoded according to him, and some of the work that he's been doing over the past several years. Junaid, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joanne. Delighted to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. And I hope all of the viewers and their families remain safe and well during this interesting time that we live in. I'm a GP by training and background, a physician trained as a surgeon, went into internal medicine, and then into general practice. Most of my last 10 years have been spent across the payer, the provider, and the regulatory space in healthcare. Last 5 years in life sciences, in the global digital role at Merck Sharp and Dome, and I'll be the incoming chief medical scientist at Microsoft. For me, this is a fascinating topic, and if I was to be slightly myopic and think about the last 8 to 12 weeks of what I've seen, is an unprecedented amount of thinking going on around what you can do almost in a wartime effort around what we need to do for COVID-19 and begin to understand a pathogen like COVID-19 in a way that has never been done before, with global groups, be they academics, hospitals, researchers, all in a combined way, thinking about not just the virus itself, but what is the pathogenicity of what happens to the virus, what happens to people, and we're still learning day in, day out on what happens. An unprecedented amount of collaboration across academia, research, and providers, taking research and translating that directly into real-world interventions. Also, what we've seen is the regulators being quite permissive in what can happen during this time. And a question for me would really be, what would this mean for what happens in a post-war period? Or as the surge reduces, what will we see now in the regulatory space and in this collaboration space around how we both access the data, how we ask the right questions of the data, and how we translate that into real world care for the patients and public that we serve. So hopefully I can bring a little bit into this conversation in and around the clinical perspective, the digital perspective emerging, and how life science companies are thinking about this space. And there's what we are in the midst of now is a real opportunity around the data that we have access to, and this constantly new generating field of data, be that on the genomic side, the economic side, the true healthcare side, and beginning to understand healthcare in ways that we could only imagine in the future. And AI has a significant role to play, not just through the better understanding of conditions, but perhaps think about new modalities of treatment and new discovery models that, again, we have not really been able to conceive in the past. Joanne, hand over back to you.
Great, thanks, Junaid. And I think you actually highlight a few things that obviously many people are trying to grapple with at the minute. We've talked about our healthcare system always being available and ready to us, but we've also now seen that there's ways to enhance that and make that better. And clearly, if we actually have a resilient, future-proof healthcare system, one that is obviously able to stand up to things like COVID and various other things that are definitely going to happen as time goes on, we can actually allow our diseases to be discovered earlier and potentially even treated differently. So do you maybe have a few thoughts on some of the trends that you've seen about how we can potentially implement some of these new technologies that have really risen to the forefront during the pandemic?
So I think there's the hype and then there's the reality. And what I've seen is a strong desire for many companies and many experts in the field to come together and want to do good. But then there's the promise of what we could do tomorrow versus what's the reality of what we can do today. And we've seen, if you take the NHS and many healthcare systems, a sudden adoption of technology in ways that people have only imagined and been speaking about. I mean, telemedicine, as an example, people have been talking about it for 10 to 15 years, and it's only really taken off in the last 12 weeks, even though the technology has existed for a long time. And I'm sure Chris will speak to this shortly, but in one of Chris's previous talks, he's often spoken about the role of access to data, access to specialists, and access to compute power. And what we have now is access to data, but how clean is that data? How curated is that data? What insights can we gain from it? The data itself probably isn't what we need. It's the insights that we can gain from it, the questions we ask of that data to then tell the story and help us understand what's that deeper meaning underneath. If we can maintain some of that collaboration across research, clinical expertise, and then power that by high compute power, perhaps we can begin to, as you point out, begin to recognize new disease patterns in ways that we've not recognized before, or maybe even begin to re-understand what that disease actually is, and then think about novel treatment mechanisms or prevention mechanisms that allow us to improve health for all of society and improve equity in healthcare in ways that we've not done before as well.
Yes, you have touched upon a few of my favorite topics, the good old structured versus unstructured data, what we actually collect, is it actually useful? Wrapping around that, we've got so much data in our healthcare systems, it's worth cajillions. It's not worth cajillions if it's not actually in a format that we can use. So perhaps now we should actually get Chris to give us a little bit of insight into some of the great work that Microsoft is doing and some of the stuff he's been doing over the past several years to really understand the power of the mechanisms that are actually required to be implemented to capture some of this data and actually make those insights come to life. So Chris, can you give us a little bit of insight into some of those subjects?
Yes, thank you, Joanne. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you to CogX for the invitation. My background actually originally is in physics, but something like 30 years ago, I was intrigued by the publication of a paper on neural networks, and I switched fields to machine learning. I've been in the field ever since, but I've always felt that healthcare is perhaps the most exciting and in many ways the most important application of this kind of technology. So what I thought I'd do to stimulate some discussion is share three rather specific thoughts about trends or key concepts, which I think are really at the core of this discussion. The first is to share briefly some remarkable developments in the field of machine learning that have happened in the last year or so. They're well known within the field, but I'm not sure they're so well known more broadly. So we all know that computers get faster and cheaper. And in fact, if you look at the history of machine learning, you'll see that, like many other domains, it's sort of ridden this wave of ever-increasing compute power. We see that the amount of compute needed to train a state-of-the-art machine learning system has doubled about every 18 months, going back since pretty much to the 1950s. But something remarkable happened starting around 2012, which was a breakthrough called deep learning. And deep learning has really depended upon the availability of lots of compute. Now, the field of deep learning or deep neural networks literally revolutionized the field of speech recognition and also the field of computer vision. And it really sparked this explosion of interest in machine learning, or as it's now called, AI, artificial intelligence. It's really about data science and machine learning. And what we've seen since 2012 is that to train the state-of-the-art systems in machine learning, the amount of compute power you need has again been growing exponentially, but it's been not doubling every 18 months or 2 years. It's been increasing by a factor of 10 every year. This is absolutely staggering, and it continues to this day. And what it means is that big tech companies, Microsoft and others, and startups as well, are putting an enormous amount of energy into trying to stay on that curve, because last year, in the last 12 months, we've seen a revolution in a third field, which is natural language processing, that was enabled by colossal amounts of compute power. Something like, imagine a petaflop computer, 10 to the 15 operations a second, working flat out for a day. That's a petaflop day. The state of the art today uses upwards of 10,000 petaflop days of compute to produce a state of the art system. That new wave of machine learning, data science technology is undoubtedly going to open up new opportunities in healthcare, and staying on that wave is going to be very exciting. And so Microsoft is doing things like partnering very closely with a company called GraphCore to roll out a completely new generation of machine learning specific processor. So that's the first one, this incredible 10x per year increase in compute power. The second thing I wanted to mention briefly is that, as we all know, there's a tension on the one hand between the belief that data, including healthcare data, has a lot of value and we can extract value from that data, at the same time recognizing that often it's personal data. We need to think very seriously about privacy. And there's clearly a tension or a trade-off between these. I think it's worth highlighting that there are technologies that can, to some extent, allow us to get the best of both worlds. For example, there are technologies called confidential compute or secure enclaves, which allow data to be protected through encryption and only decrypted actually within the processor itself. This offers extremely high levels of security, of privacy, in which the machine learning happens only inside the chip. Nobody can access it, and the results can then be shared as appropriate, but nobody has access to the raw data except the originators of the data. And that is one of a class of so-called privacy enhancing technologies, which allow us, I think, to get some of the benefits of extracting information from data while also preserving privacy. So awareness of the existence of those technologies and the fact that it's not a simple choice between either creating healthcare value or maintaining privacy, I think it's important to be at least aware of the existence of those technologies. The final comment that I wanted to make really concerns the impact of if you like, the data revolution, the AI, the machine learning revolution, as it unfolds in the world of healthcare over the years ahead. We know in many other domains that this will change the nature of work. Some kinds of roles will disappear, new ones will appear. There's a lot of discussion about the impact of these technologies on the world of work. And it's very interesting to understand how that will look in the world of healthcare. I think there will be changes, but I think concerns that, and Junaid, I'm sure will be pleased to hear this, but concerns that somehow clinicians will disappear and be replaced by apps, I think that's extremely far-fetched and very, very unlikely. I think what will happen, though, is there will be this very deep partnership between the machine learning and the clinicians. Somebody once said that AI isn't going to replace radiologists, but radiologists who use AI will replace those who don't use AI. So there will be an impact. The impact will be quite subtle and interesting in some ways. It will change the nature of human expertise. So expertise that is simply built up from years of experience, let's say a dermatologist who's seen thousands and thousands of examples of lesions, knows which one is likely to be cancerous and which one is not. That's something that machines are going to do much better because they can process much larger quantities of data in a much more quantitative way. The richer skill set that clinicians have, including the human interface and really understanding the bigger picture of taking the results from machine learning, probabilities of cancer and so on, and translating that into a care pathway that's tailored to the individual is something that's, I think, a very human-centric activity, and that's not going to disappear anytime soon. So let me offer those three thoughts as a stimulus for discussion.
Excellent, great, thank you very much. I think you've highlighted a couple things in there that probably both terrify and intrigue people. So we often hear about we need to collect data, we need all sorts of data, which we do, I believe. But then you also highlight the privacy aspect of it. And I think, you know, there's a lot of expertise, I believe, I'm assuming within Microsoft as well, that has actually been used in the banking industry that we're actually now taking and putting into healthcare. Because many of us several years ago, when we first got online banking or we first got an app on our phone, we didn't think twice about sticking our thumb onto the phone and magically our whole banking statements came up. And I often argue, with my background in genomics, I often argue that I can show you my whole genome sequence, or I can show you my bank statement, and you'll actually learn a lot more about me from the bank statement because you've got my address, you've got a lot of other information about me. So some of these technologies about privacy, how do we actually communicate that these are things that are enhancing the ability to decode disease, but we actually have to collect that data? What are some of the things that Microsoft has done in that space?
You're absolutely right. The core to this is data. We talk about artificial intelligence, but it's really all about data and the ability to extract information from data. And as Junaid indicated, many of us believe there is a huge potential here. The question is, how can technologies help this? And especially in the healthcare domain, where we quite rightly view personal healthcare data as private. By the same token, though, I think there's also a sense of not only wanting to protect our personal data, but certainly speaking for myself, I feel slightly cross that my data isn't being used. I'm aware that as part of a much larger cohort of people, information about my healthcare could be used collectively to improve lives, to improve healthcare outcomes, and even save lives. And so there is this tension, and where technologies can help. I'll give you a concrete example. A specific piece of technology that's deployed in the Microsoft cloud. It's called Azure Confidential Compute, and it's the first technology of its kind. And it links back to the comment I made earlier. This is an ability to take data in encrypted form, so it's completely protected, but you can't do anything very much with encrypted data. You have to decrypt it in order to use it. The decryption only happens on chip where the processing occurs, and then the results can be encrypted. And for example, that means that data processed in this way in the Microsoft cloud is completely invisible even to Microsoft. Even somebody in the data center with attaching wires to the processor would still only see encrypted data. That provides a high level of security, and there are things you can do with that. Let me give you an example. We know that machine learning improves when you have more data, generally speaking, and when you bring in data from different sources. So you can imagine situations, let's say a number of hospitals have image data and they want to share that image data to produce better results, but they don't want other hospitals to have visibility of their own data set, as it were. This kind of Azure Confidential Compute technology would allow you to pool the data from different providers in a single processor, run machine learning, get outputs, models, predictions that are better than can be obtained on any one data set alone. But in the process, each provider of the data only has visibility of their own data, nobody else's. And the cloud provider, in this case Microsoft, has visibility of none of that data. So that's just one illustration of how technology can help unlock the power of data without compromising privacy.
Yeah, fascinating. And I think these are the things that we really need to allow citizens, the public, to understand a bit more, because we often end up having people seeming to be quite afraid about sharing data. What does that really mean? And I think fundamentally, as you said, most people actually want data to be used to actually make their treatment plans more accurate and more personalized towards them as well. So how do we start to communicate that? And I think some of these tangible examples, communicating them better and actually having a much more collaborative approach to it is really the way forward. So I guess when we're talking also about data and thinking about federated analytics and various things like that, this has to be a core component of the work that's actually happening, obviously, at companies like Benevolent. So I'm going to now turn it over to Mark to give us a little bit of insight into the ways that they both collect data, use data, and actually use that to understand the biology and try to actually design compounds that are going to be used to treat disease. So over to you, Mark.
Oh, thank you, Joanna. And thank you to the CogX team as well for inviting us to attend this session. So yeah, my name's Mark Davies. I head up the informatics and data functions at Benevolent. And this is really focused on bringing together kind of the informatics capabilities that allow us to really delve into data, model, represent, and prepare it in ways that actually supports many of the downstream applications, whether it be data science, analytics, machine learning, to allow us to ask the questions that enable drug discovery with that BenevolentAI. So my background, I've been with Benevolent for the last 5 years, and it's been an interesting evolution, seeing a company grow from 20, 30 people up to around 300 now, and really trying to make this change within the drug discovery setting. Prior to being at Benevolent, I've been involved in a lot of these larger data integration activities, European projects, as well as with biotechs within London. So this really is at the heart of my interest and looking to make this difference at Benevolent. I'd also like to start by sort of setting a bit of setting the scene as well, and I guess why many of us here are here today. And I think one of the key reasons is, there are currently thousands of diseases out there which have no treatment, and we're spending tens of billions each year really trying to support kind of a broken system, which is leaving millions of patients without hope of a cure. And I think this is kind of really fundamental to many of when we think about data, when we think about processes, when we're bringing all of these components together, what we're trying to fix as a whole. And certainly from Benevolent's perspective, and my own as well, the key thing here is around how we can better leverage breakthrough technologies that allow us to really kind of make the best opportunity of the vast and ever expanding libraries and quantities of biomedical information that is being made available to the scientific community. And I think that's really the ethos which we take on as a company, and many others working in this sector as well. And touching on some of the technologies that Chris was referring to, how we can utilize those to make better usage of that data that is available to us. Us as a company, I'd love to a bit more details about how we think about it. So we are building technology in service of science, really in an augmented fashion. So we're aiming to support our drug discovery team at Benevolent by building the specific technologies that allow them to undertake things like target identification, target validation, lead optimization within the chemistry space, and these deeper insights within precision medicine, and bringing together the best in class in AI, machine learning, informatics, and other technologies that allow us to transform the way drugs are discovered and ultimately developed. And as an outcome from this, we've really put together an end-to-end process that captures all of this. But underpinning our target ID approaches, AI chemistry, precision medicine, is a knowledge foundation. And again, it's identifying what is the right data, where it has maximal impact across many of these different areas, and how it can be served, represented, formatted in ways that enable, in the first instance, sometimes just searching that data and identifying for a given sort of chemistry program, what is the underlying data I need to generate a model that help me predict a particular molecule will bind with the target. We're in target ID, really understanding what is the underlying biological processes that are potentially going wrong within a given disease, and surfacing those as quickly as possible to that discovery team, and allow us to have what we've kind of focused on is really this mechanistic discovery approach within drug discovery. So what are these mechanisms within diseases that we believe are broken, and how can we understand them better and ultimately define therapeutics and treatments to make a change in that particular space. And again, this does sort of speak to really a history, and I think the industry as a whole is how we can think to better define things like disease and symptoms. We're leveraging a lot of public resources, public ontologies, payer systems like ICD-10. And again, these don't really represent what is going wrong. They were built for different reasons, but we're using and leveraging these within our platforms in ways to surface that information. But we need to think about this slightly differently. What is the underlying network representation? What are the proteins involved? What are the tissues, the cell lines, the cell types, the expression levels that are going on to really break down what is happening within that given disease? And it's a key part around our integration process that allows us to have that context and really sort of break into and understand for a given disease area what is going on. And this really sort of kickstarts the entire process for us, going from end-to-end drug discovery and supporting ultimately patients at the end of this. Thinking sort of longer term, there's probably like 3 areas for myself when I think about data and over the next 10 years, and a number of challenges that I think we should be sort of tackling as a sector around how we can sort of improve things. This is basically from my own experiences, but as well as I'm sure for many others on the call and attending this particular session. But one of the common threads or themes that we find is that we're often finding ourselves with limited amounts of data to answer those questions that matter most. And it's kind of an interesting challenge, this, because it's actually one of the driving forces which has allowed us to generate and identify new machine learning AI technologies. You know, there's Chris referred to it earlier around some of these approaches in sort of deep learning, but somebody's really sort of tackling this limited data challenge, how we can really make the most of that information and come up with predictive models that actually rely on less data. Things like zero shot, few shot, meta learning, active learning, really sort of putting together various approaches, networks, feedback loops, improved parameter optimizations around these types of models that actually allow us to gain better insights and hopefully more powerful models. But at the end of the day, there is also, I think, a need for us as an industry to be sort of pinpointing those data sets that do matter most. And we should be really focusing on creating those and making sure these are available to the broader communities, outside of also sort of commercial settings as well. And certainly from within our own systems, you know, some of the technologies referred to when we come to NLP technologies, how we extract entities and relationships that feed into our knowledge graph. These rely on some of these state-of-the-art AI, ML approaches, similar for chemistry when we think about the design, synthesis, and test cycles. Again, active learning cycles, really leveraging much of the these lower quantity data sets and pulling out novel insights from those. And within precision medicine as well, when we think about latent models. So for me, over the next 10 years, identifying those types of data sets that we should be investing in, making sure they're available to the community, is a key thing that we should be talking about, making sure that are available. Another challenge as well from my side is also some of the barriers to access to data more generally. So we often find ourselves in positions where we may not have access to the data, or it might not be there, or there's other situations where the data is there, but there's actually barriers in the way to allowing us access and making maximum utilization. And this can be anything from sort of potentially in some cases complex licensing, or even through to historic clinical data being collected without the right kind of consent in place to allow some of the research that would make maximal impact for patients involved. And in other cases, we simply just don't even know the data exists. And this is kind of very interesting. I think with the current COVID situation, one of the outcomes is it's really kind of mobilized and brought together many data providers to make data available and, you know, allow us to come up with new novel insights very quickly. And this has really been built on many open data initiatives and just making that information available free of many of the constraints. And as a result, we're going to be very rapidly seeing outcomes, new treatments, new understandings of a disease, which is kind of unprecedented. So be one area as well is how we can think about breaking down those barriers. And if there's any lesson learned from this current situation around COVID, can this be transferred to other treatments, other disease areas as well? And again, yeah, quite concretely, these kind of open data initiatives really will save lives in terms of bringing that data to bear and realizing its maximum opportunity. Certainly, I mean, I'd call out one very interesting data set as part of COVID is the COVID-19 open research data set created by the Allen Institute, which brought together publications from, publications, full text publications, abstract information, which are previously behind sort of paywalls, wasn't allowed full access to the research community, commercial community, so that's to allow information extraction, understanding what's going on. This is now made available and is actually feeding into much of the knowledge graph, information extraction approaches, and novel insights that are allowing us to better understand that disease. So that's been an exciting development, certainly from our side and many other researchers within the field. And again, we as a company have actually benefited from that, from our own work within the Barrow system, which I'm happy to talk about later. The final point in terms of limited data, barriers to access, is also acknowledge that there is a lack of data diversity within the data sets that we are using as well. And again, this speaks to not having enough coverage around ethnicity, sex, age within those data sets, having representative of the population. And again, as we go forward, these large data sets which are being collected is acknowledging that there are some gaps, or quite big gaps in certain instances, and making sure as we do go forward, we look to address these and make sure we're not missing out on particular parts of the populations going forward. When we think about precision medicine efforts, we aren't leaving people behind. So that's certainly a big area for us as a company. We've set up a data diversity initiative that's really starting to focus the minds and efforts and reducing this data gap. Again, I'm happy to discuss that. Maybe sort of pass back to Joanna.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And I think, we're all highlighting some really quite fundamental things that keep coming up in slightly different guises. Data does need to be collected. Not only does it need to be collected, it needs to be consented for appropriately. That data then needs to be made available. It doesn't need to necessarily be held in a silo and owned by one particular institution or individual. The more data is actually used, the better insights that one gets. And when we think about trying to even take it a step back and saying, how do we actually stop people from getting sick? Surely a healthcare system should be there to treat sick people, but surely we should be thinking about trying to prevent people from getting sick in the first place. And there's been quite a lot of research being done, obviously, with genetic diseases and trying to get that diagnosis faster so that the treatment plan is much more applicable for the individual. But with respect to, obviously, the data sources, small companies, large companies, academics, everyone needs access to this. I think I have seen quite a lot of collaboration, especially because of the current pandemic that we're experiencing, and allowing individuals to share that data a bit better. So, Mark, with respect to the data that you guys are getting that you didn't have before, is this different types of data, or is it just you're seeing the barriers to entry be reduced a little bit more?
I think it's a combination of both. So, in our particular case, like many companies working on COVID sort of challenges at this moment, we set up a team to really sort of understand and focus. Can we better understand the disease? Is there an opportunity to identify a new mechanism that may prevent the virus kind of really taking effect? And as a result of, I guess, many initiatives from across the Allen Institute, Amazon, and I'm sure Microsoft as well, are putting together and indexing data sets, Google as well, on sort of the Kaggle side, making these available to large groups, large research, and allowing these kind of insights and just making that awareness. For us, again, we are kind of very much focused on human disease, the underlying mechanisms that are going wrong there. Can we apply that within kind of a viral or infectious disease setting? And in a particular case, this was the focus of the repurposing effort that we put into the baricitinib, and identifying that as a potential sort of novel treatment within COVID-19. And again, this is currently in trials at this moment. But yeah, I think identifying and categorizing what data is available and then making it available, and then the outputs from that research, us then making that available to the community more broadly has been sort of the key thing, I think, and a big lesson learned from this entire COVID situation.
Yes, well, may that trend continue. Let's hope that we are allowed to see much more of that data that's collected, and obviously to have more insight and input into the way it's collected, and obviously the way that it's used as well, and really engaging the patient population as a whole. But one thing that I'm going to actually circle back to Junaid on is talking about, we're talking about all these great new ways to accelerate disease and diagnose it earlier, all of this stuff with machine learning and feeding all these algorithms. How are you, as a physician, going to stay on top of all of that? How is this going to be taught in our universities? And if we outsource a lot of these machine learning algorithms for imaging, for example, when someone comes in with a rather straightforward case, how will you actually know what that is? So that there was a lot there to put on you, but clearly you're going to solve everyone's healthcare issues in the next 2 minutes. So let's get your thoughts on that.
So I'd probably start by saying medicine is an art and a science. So the science is super important, and the science is augmenting. So the practice of medicine that I would do today is very different to when I first became a doctor and I was allowed to be by myself and go see patients when I was a junior doctor in 2004. And every 2 years, I've seen a change in terms of my own personal curiosity, how I practice. And if I take a specialty like oncology today, you have companies that are doing 1,200 trials in the space across multiple different countries, and that's just a single company. So if for any single molecule there are 1,000 or 5,000 trials, how on earth can I ensure that the patient in front of me tomorrow is getting the best in class, most real world evidence, most evidence-based practice and treatment opportunities at that moment in time? And it's impossible for me to compute all of that. It'll be based on the last journal that I read or the last journal club I went to, because the way that I learn is pretty much the same way that I've always learned, although the practice of medicine and the opportunities around me are changing constantly. But we have to remember that ultimately I have to translate all of this information and the information that's being presented to me either by a computer or by some algorithm into a risk model in my own head that I then have to translate into that patient and that very personal experience at that very vulnerable moment in time. And that translation is the art of medicine, is how you hold the hand and how you take people through that journey. And there are core elements of medicine that won't change. But to Chris's point and to Mark's points earlier, if I'm able to have additional superpowers that allow me to diagnose faster, that allow me to care for that patient in a way that I've not been able to do before, I have to be able to exploit those. And I need the regulators around me to give me the permission to practice in the way that allows me to do it. I need the Royal Colleges in the UK and the academies internationally to allow me to use these new tools at my disposal and not hold back. So we need a willingness and an openness and true collaboration that sets in ground truth what the opportunities with technology can be. And I remember speaking to Chris a couple of months ago, and I said, I think engineers and computer scientists and others are fantastic, but we need to marry them up with clinicians and doctors and people with subject matter expertise to ensure that the right questions are being asked that are relevant to the patient, that are relevant to providers, and are relevant to society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, it's that I think one of the things that the pandemic has highlighted to a lot of individuals who's worked in those silos, it just doesn't work, right? If you look at our healthcare system, it is actually, it's under a lot of strain at the minute. If we actually had thought previously, and clearly why would we, and actually implemented some of these mechanisms, this wouldn't be happening. We actually would be able to treat disease in a slightly different way, and even on the prevention side as well. But this actually highlights something that actually I'll turn to Chris towards, is we keep talking about, all of this data and platforms that people have to, access it. One of the things that Junaid just pointed out was obviously making sure the regulators are on side. You guys keep talking about all of the privacy enhancing features that you have in decentralized privacy and various things like that. How does that all get factored into what you're allowed to actually give to companies like Benevolent and allow, coming in from the NHS and marrying it up? How does that actually work? And what would be your wish list to ask the regulators to help you with? You've got the systems in place and you've had them for years. How can you actually get that knowledge translated?
I think it's great, a great question. I think, as Mark highlighted, sort of access to the data is one of the bottlenecks that's limiting, I think, what we might achieve in this space. It's not just about regulation, and sometimes the regulators, I think, are running to keep up with the pace of change. I think, as you, Joanne, actually highlighted earlier, a lot of it has to do with trust. In a democratic society, we have to carry people with us. So it's about transparency, it's about trust. I think, in a way, the pandemic, although it's a terrible disease and we're far from being through it, this cloud has a few silver linings. I find it remarkable that we have daily briefings live on television, on the internet, from Downing Street, in which they show graphs and talk about data science. And we see that data is playing a critical role in managing this pandemic. And I think that's really shining a spotlight on the opportunity. So I think that will really help accelerate. In fact, there's no doubt about it. Things which would have taken 6 months, a year to get approval to go and do are happening in the space of weeks or even days sometimes, because we see there's an imperative, and every day that we delay, more lives are put at risk. So for me, it's not just about regulation. The regulation is one component in that bigger picture.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, as you've also highlighted, I'm sure there have been advances, and potentially, Mark, you can comment on this, even at Benevolent over the last, a couple of months that have probably been faster than what you would have anticipated. But even more fundamentally than a faster diagnosis or a faster way of being able to aggregate or look at your data or make inferences, is there more of a move, do you think, towards, smaller companies, I suppose pharma as well, large pharma, to actually start thinking about understanding the mechanism for the prevention aspect of it? Or are we still, do you think, in that space where people think there's not really any money in prevention and who's going to pay for it, clearly aside from vaccines, which is the most important prevention, I suppose. But what are your thoughts on that, Mark, thinking about more of a model towards understanding the mechanism of the disease and understanding how we actually prevent individuals from getting sick to begin with?
Yeah, I think there certainly is an appetite to tackle it really, from a disease perspective, literally from the ground up, understanding, prevent the disease from taking effect. The reality is many of our data sets, many of our understandings are actually geared more the treatment side, and there's again an inherent bias that's what the space that we're operating in. So yeah, from the going back to some of our own work, which sort of very public just around kind of COVID-19, how we can better understand with the data that we have available right now, how the virus kind of enters the body, like endocytosis types of processes, how we can think about blocking those, and what data, we have vast amounts of data and understanding what is actually happening there. And then are there molecules that are already kind of available which can actually potentially prevent parts of those pathways? And this is kind of our proposal and suggestion, which is kind of in trials at the moment. As you say, vaccines are obviously the gold standard really in this particular space. And when we look now at the number of companies that are in a position to actually come up with vaccines, it's not too many, but there's quite a lot of actually that can think more of treatment kind of proposals. So I think this is, thinking over the next 10 years, this is probably something we do need to change, but it's probably more from a top-down, almost governmental kind of approaches and scientific advisory within countries provide both the incentives and access to the data side that will allow this kind of initiative to go forward. But from our side, we're very much, I guess, in the treatment space at this moment, and probably will be for a while.
Yeah, and I do think, though, with all of the treatments that are coming out, we're getting better at being able to stratify patients. The more data that's collected, a plethora of omics data that's being collected to help us with that. So I do think that we will start to see that needle shift slowly but surely. So we're just going to wrap up now. We have a couple of minutes left, and I think one of the things that I've taken from this conversation is that we've got great expertise in understanding disease. We've got great expertise in treating it, in building platforms to be able to make sure all of that data moves around. And I think we're hopefully finally at the stage where some of this is really going to be implemented, because we can see the beauty of doing that and the benefit of doing that. So I'm just going to ask each of the panelists to give a very brief wish list, I suppose, or a call to action as what would help you to do your job better and to have a bigger impact on society to help us decode disease. I'll turn to you, Junaid, first.
So I would say, let's ensure that we're really solving the problems of today before we jump on solving the problems of tomorrow. Excellent. Chris?
I think for me, it's all about partnership. We've touched on this point several times. I do think that technology companies like Microsoft have important things to offer, but certainly tech companies aren't going to solve healthcare in any sense at all. So it's all about partnership. In fact, everything we do in Microsoft in the healthcare space is done in partnership with hospitals, with biotech companies, with pharmaceutical companies, and so on. So my wish list for the years ahead is just to deepen and strengthen those partnerships.
Great. And over to you, Mark.
Yeah, I think maybe putting at the center, putting sort of patients first in terms of better understanding of what their data can actually mean and its impact. And with that kind of reassured kind of buy-in, it can lead to sort of greater utilization and hopefully sort of new biobanking initiatives, collecting of sort of more omics and clinical information that can really drive some of these initiatives that we're all striving towards. So that'd be my kind of major play there.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Joanne, so much for moderating this panel and to our fabulous panelists for a really, really interesting session. I think you kind of summarized really interestingly, I guess, the kind of key issues that you would like, I guess, kind of people to remember, that kind of centrality of putting kind of the patient first, the importance of developing partnerships to be able to solve some of these issues, and kind of really interestingly as well, that kind of issue of temporality, that there's potentially a kind of particular moment in time at which you're supposed to solve some issues, and that actually, you know, maybe you might be thinking strategically ahead about the kind of issues of tomorrow, but actually the more pressing thing is to solve the ones of today. We talked about loads of different kind of topics, looking at the various techniques that could be applied to gain a deeper understanding of biology and healthcare, touched on topics like kind of privacy enhancing technologies and how that might be able to kind of ease access to data, or at least have a more secure access to data, and some of also the kind of silver linings brought about by this pandemic in terms of, you know, giving a sense of imperative and need to really square that data equation within healthcare. So thank you again so much for this really very interesting session. So what will happen next on the health stage is that we will be having a fireside chat at 12 between Professor Greg White and Dr. Jack Kreindler. They will be talking about beyond the limits on the edge of human performance and how it helps our health. So we will see you back at 12 on the health stage. And there will be no Q&A kind of meet the speaker session with our fabulous panelists. So thank you so much again for joining us.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.